Welcome to Lost in the Movies. This week I have a special treat. This is not only a private episode, this is also a public episode. So this is not just for patrons. If you're listening to this on YouTube, as you know, I'm providing this for everybody to listen to, both as sort of a peek behind the curtains of what I'm doing on Patreon, and also an invitation, of course, to join. If you want to become a patron, it's $1 a month. You can listen to this podcast, and then you get some extra rewards at higher levels as well, so check it out. If you missed the previous episode, I covered the Robert Bresson film A Man Escaped, and I also covered some Twin Peaks music, my top 15 tracks from Twin Peaks. I think you'll enjoy that if you want to go back in a week and check out what I was doing then. And thank you to everybody who's joined as a patron, for everyone considering joining, and of course just for everybody who's listening or supporting my work in any way, even if they're not able to become a patron or not interested right now. But I hope you'll consider it. For the YouTube audience, I want to just give you a quick overview in case you're not familiar with this podcast format. What I do every week is I introduce myself to the audience, talk about what we're going to be talking about this week, and then I give some updates on what I've been working on, both the things that I've published recently and also things that I'm working on behind the scenes. In some cases, stuff that won't come out for months, possibly even like a year. Because I like to do a lot of things ahead of time. So that's kind of a cool sneak peek. After that, I'm going to be doing my Twin Peaks reflections every week. I used to do Film and Focus first, but I've kind of switched the order of those because I'm doing a return rewatch for Twin Peaks. That's going to start on the 1-year anniversary of the season 3 premiere, so on May 21st. And up until then, I'm building up to it by covering different parts of the Twin Peaks saga before that. So this week I'm covering the anniversary of the pilot. It came out 28 years ago this week. And next week I'll cover the first season and so forth, second season and Fire Walk with Me and other things that happened between the seasons. And then we'll kind of build up to season 3 that way. So that's going to be really fun for people to follow, I think. My own personal mini rewatch for about 15 or 20 minutes each episode. Then I cover a Film and Focus. Up until June, it's going to be patron recommendations that I got during the winter. There was a reward at one point where I was offering commissions if people wanted to choose the Film and Focus topic. I'm not doing that anymore, but I'm still fulfilling the ones that I got. So this week, for example, I'm going to be talking about Eyes Wide Shut with a special guest, Andrew Cook. And that's a rare thing. Usually it's just me talking about the film, but sometimes I like to bring someone else on to discuss with. I also do other topics, and that can be anything from podcast recommendations from things that I've been listening to other things that I'm talking about on Twitter, perhaps. And this week it's actually going to be a focus on just one topic, Mary Shelley and the legacy of Frankenstein, because that was something I was talking about on Twitter recently that I wanted to expand on. And then the final part of the show, after I do some listener feedback, which can vary week to week depending on what people have written in, I do an Opening the Archive feature. That's especially geared toward the 10th anniversary of my site this spring. I'm moving through each period of my blogging and talking about videos I've made, essays I've written, and what the general spirit of that time was, because you can really break it down into different eras. I even give a name to each chapter, sort of describing what was going on at that point. And this week I'm actually discussing the period where I made my short film, Class of 2002, which was exhibited on the blog. So this whole week really turned out to be well suited for a public episode, between kicking off the prelude to the rewatch series and doing a discussion on a big Stanley Kubrick film, and then also talking about one of the most significant periods in my own archive. So I hope you really enjoy these features this week, and that this kind of gives you a sense of what to expect week to week if you decide to become a patron. For the updates this week, I covered the tail end of Mad Men Season 1. I've been doing a viewing diary every day, and I covered episodes 10 through 13 since the last Patreon episode. I was especially taken with the last couple episodes, one called Nixon versus Kennedy, which uses the election as a backdrop, but it tells kind of a very important personal story about Don. And then the last one, which was a little quieter, although it had some dramatic moments, really appealed to me as well. And you can find all those write-ups on the site right now. I also cross-posted my discussion with Twin Peaks Unwrapped about the Twin Peaks pilot, which I'll mention some in my own upcoming segment. It was me J.C. Hotchkiss from 25 Years Later, and John Thorne from Wrapped in Plastic in the Blue Rose magazine. We all gathered together via the magic of Google Hangouts or Skype. I think we had technical difficulties and we had to figure it out. But we ended up talking for about an hour and a half just on the pilot and the script for it and what things changed and everything like that. I also did some more David Lynch pieces this week. One of them was on the art life as, the documentary about Lynch's artwork and his biography, and I reviewed that. But then the next day I did a visual tribute to that film, which was a great fun to put together because there's just so many gorgeous visuals in that movie. Not just his paintings, but also photos of his youth and the behind-the-scenes work of him working on these paintings that the cameraman captured. And then the last thing I posted before this was a Star Trek standalone novelty episode, the unaired pilot from the original Star Trek. I'm going to do a viewing diary at some point for the whole series, but right now I'm just publishing things every day, and I thought this would be a good time to share what I'd already written on this odd little episode where there's a different actor playing the captain. It's not Captain Kirk, and a lot of the other actors are missing. It's just kind of an interesting thing to see if you're a little bit familiar with Star Trek like I am, but not like a fan or somebody who's watched that many episodes. On Patreon, I didn't do too much this week, other than just posting this, of course. I did have to correct an accidental posting that went up on Sunday. That's just a technical note that I should probably mention if you saw that. I had planned to post this episode on the anniversary date of the pilot, but I just wasn't able to because I was on a vacation. Behind the scenes, I've been working on a lot of stuff, mostly to do with the podcast, but also watching the Mad Men Season 2 premiere. That's something that I'm not going to publish in the near future because I'm going to wait until I've finished the entire Mad Men series to share the seasons after Season 1. And I'm not sure if it was 61, 62, or 63 that they jumped to. But, you're seeing a different year. You're seeing the fashions change subtly. And I'm always fascinated with seeing historical eras shift and little transformations take place. So this is going to be a really fun show to watch in that sense. I also worked on a longer piece I'm doing about Fire Walk With Me elements in Season 3. I wrote the entry on Jeffries within that. That's something that'll probably be published in August. And along with a couple other Fire Walk With Me pieces that I've written or I'm about to write, including a comparison of Fire Walk With Me with horror films, art films, other Twin Peaks episodes, and other David Lynch films, and also a history of the production and a look actually at an early draft of the screenplay, which I'm going to get my hands on soon, which is going to be really fun. I also did an interview with Cameron Cloutier, who many of you probably know from the Obnoxious and Anonymous channel. He's producing directing a really interesting looking fan film about Annie and his kind of story of where she's been and what's happened to her. And there's a great trailer up. I'll put it in the show notes, both on YouTube and on the Patreon page, where you can see the character wandering through various Twin Peaks locations. Like he actually went and filmed at the Palmer House. And he did another cool promo, which I'll link up, with Freddy. Not Freddy, but Jake Wardle, who plays Freddy, the Green Glove Man, speaking to Annie. And that was really cool. Like, it's the actual guy who's actually a YouTuber, so it totally makes sense that he'd do that. And during this interview, I spoke with both Cameron and the actress Amy, who's going to be playing Annie. It was really fun to do, and that's going to be a written interview. I'm going to transcribe it over the next few weeks, and that'll probably go up in early May, so you can look for that then. I also decided on my schedule for the upcoming months, so I'll lay that out here. I'm going to focus pretty much exclusively on viewing diaries. That's the easiest thing for me to put together and keep up a steady pattern until my anniversary on July 16th. So here's roughly what you can expect with that, with a few little surprises interspersed in between. I'm going to do the Lars von Trier series, The Kingdom. There's 2 seasons of that. There's like Kingdom 1 and Kingdom 2. It's about this weird haunted hospital. And I've done a few episodes of that. They're really short seasons, so that shouldn't be too hard to put together. And actually, before I do that, I'm going to lead up to a Clone Wars series, the Star Wars animated series. That full viewing diary will go up later, but I'm going to be re-reviewing the prequels and the Genndy Tartakovsky series that was made before the official Clone Wars series, and also the animated film that came out before that. And then I'm doing a discussion with Bob Clark, who's a big Star Wars and Clone Wars fan, about that. In May, I'm going to start 3 first season viewing diaries. First up will be Veronica Mars, second up will be The X-Files, and third up will be The Wire, and that'll take me right up to my anniversary. So that's what you can expect in coming months. And now that we've kind of done that maintenance and let you know what's in store and what you can expect on the site, we're going to move into the Twin Peaks Reflections, the first of a prelude to my rewatch of The Return. So I hope you enjoy this segment on the pilot, just in time for the 28th anniversary. The Twin Peaks pilot aired on April 8th, 1990. At this time, it kind of fit into several different interesting genres. It definitely was a nighttime, primetime soap like Dynasty or Dallas. It was also a police procedural, and that was something that Mark Frost, the co-creator of Twin Peaks, as you probably know, had quite a bit of experience with, because he'd written several seasons of Hill Street Blues for Stephen Bochco, who just passed away this week, by the way. The show, in addition to that, was also a TV movie. That's something interesting to think about. It was a 2-hour event on this Sunday night. So for some people, they watched this episode and they never necessarily watched it again. It did have the highest ratings of any Twin Peaks episode. Huge ratings by today's standards, and not bad by then either. I think about 33 million viewers. So really, until you get up to the end, when it's kind of left with this open-ended teaser for the following week, it kind of functions as both a TV movie and a TV episode. And I think that's a really interesting aspect about the episode that makes it differ from a lot of the rest of the series. And we talked about this on the Twin Peaks Unwrapped discussion that I did recently. John Thorne specifically mentioned that, for David Lynch, part of the reason he always goes back to the pilot and keeps mentioning it and saying the pilot's the thing, even though there's so much about Twin Peaks that Lynch would bring to it that isn't in the pilot yet, like most of the supernatural elements, some of the stranger filmmaking techniques that he would use. Nonetheless, he keeps coming back and saying, oh, the pilot, the pilot. And as John pointed out, a big reason for that is that he shot it on location like a movie. It was like a short production, I think maybe something like 28 days, but it was a film production, essentially. He went up there, brought his crew, brought his cast, and kind of broke it down that way, whereas the rest of it was filmed on an LA soundstage, the rest of Season 1 and Season 2. And then when he made Firewalk with Me, he wanted to go back and re-experience that atmosphere of the town. And you can really feel that atmosphere in this episode, and that's something I think is really cool about it. It feels like the world extends off screen in an interesting way, and in a subtle way, as brilliantly designed as the rest of the seasons are, they have more of, like, I call them kind of a Disneyland quality, where they're recreating something in this sort of artificial environment. And that in itself is really fun. But there's also something to be said for going to these real places and capturing that kind of authenticity on screen. And that's a way in which the pilot feels more like a film in a lot of ways than a TV episode, particularly for that time. There's really a very lived-in quality to the show. I think you see this a lot in the high school scenes, which you don't really see that much of in the rest of the show. But, it feels like these teenagers are really going to school. They have their little in-jokes and banter. And there's all these people kind of bustling about. There's a principal we never see again. I think a vice principal we don't see again. Teachers. It just feels like a fully inhabited world that Lynch is peeking into. And as such, there's also like a naturalistic feel to it that you don't see as much later, where everything's a little more heightened. Even though the pilot has those eccentricities, those moments where you don't know if you're supposed to laugh, where maybe the soap opera melodramatics are pitched a little bit high, nonetheless, there's a sort of a low-key natural quality, I find, to the performances and to the shooting, and just to the look of it in general. And a lot of that has to do, I think, with finding these places and letting them kind of inform the mood of the piece. Now, of course, this is also a TV episode, and part of the interest, I think, in watching it is imagining where it could go from here if you can kind of divorce yourself from knowing anything about the rest of Twin Peaks, to almost view it with those fresh eyes. And I feel like this time watching it, for whatever reason, I just watched it again tonight, I had that sense a little bit. It might be because I went on vacation for a little while. I was kind of away from Twin Peaks stuff. And in addition, I was also watching some other shows. Like I said in the intro, I watched a lot of Mad Men. So maybe I was kind of able to come at it a little bit as if I was somebody sitting down in 1990 watching this show called Twin Peaks for the first time. And also, actually, I watched it at my parents' house. They have a bigger TV than I do, so I thought that might be fun to revisit it there. And they kind of wandered in the second half, and we're watching it actually for the first time. They've seen a lot of The Return before, oddly enough. I think far more of The Return than the first two seasons, which is an interesting experience. But, that gave me a little bit of a fresh eyes on it, too, as they kind of commented on it and watched it unfold. So one thing I talked about with Twin Peaks Unwrapped that I want to reiterate a little bit here is this notion that, the show could go anywhere. There's all these open threads, and I think Lynch and Frost's work is so interesting because they don't plan everything ahead of time. They create things and then they kind of see where it will lead. And that leads to almost these parallel universes in your mind where it's like, well, what if Cooper had a romance with Josie, which he was supposed to do? That was something that they intended. Or, what about Donna and her sister? Like, it seems like they have this kind of friendly, bantering relationship, but then we barely ever see her again. That seems like something that could have been picked up on. As far as the killer, both Lynch and Frost, did not know who it would be at this point, according to Frost. He said they figured it out after the pilot. And you can see all these clues, of who it could be, but at the same time, those were more things that they put in maybe unconsciously and then went back and said, who's the killer? Who's the killer? I think this is him. So that's kind of interesting to see unfold. And there's almost a sense that there's some cult in the town. There's some secret society or some dark occult thing, not spirits per se, but like people in the town gathering at night, like something out of Young Goodman Brown. The Diary plays into the sense at times too, and a lot of season 1 does, this idea that there's a conspiracy going on in the town, hidden under the surface. And that doesn't really play out in the end, but it's interesting to kind of think that maybe they thought that's where it would go. I know on the alt.tv.twinpeaks board, the Usenet board of the time, there were people who speculated that maybe it would be something like The Wicker Man. Maybe people were even trying to trap Cooper or something. There's just all these possibilities, and it's fun to go back after you've seen the show a few times and you've watched the pilot, thinking of the rest of the series, and kind of remind yourself of what those possibilities could be. In the discussion, John mentions that they didn't know who was reaching into the dirt at the end with the gloved hand. Clearly this was something they shot, even though Jacoby wasn't, it was in the script, but Jacoby himself wasn't in the script. So this wasn't intended to be Jacoby. This was just like, hey, this is a cool way to end this. And there's a lot of stuff like that in this episode, things that they just put in and then they said, we'll figure out later. And I'm actually intrigued by the idea of if they maybe did that with season 3 as well, even though they wrote it all before they shot it that time. If, the way Frost describes it, they wrote the first 2 hours before the rest of it. And I wonder if instead of outlining the whole plot, they said, okay, well, what if they're in this place in South Dakota and they find a body there? And what if Shelley is in the bar and she sees this guy waving to her across the bar? And like they came up with these scenes and then later figured out what to do with them. I love that idea, although I have no idea if it's true. And that's something I'll discuss more when I do get to the Return rewatch. Another thing that's struck me this time was that Catherine seems genuinely upset about Josie shutting down the sawmill. And that's another thing that to me suggests they kind of retconned it later and said, oh, no, she was just pretending to be upset. But I don't think that's what they had. That wouldn't be the most straightforward way to do this. I think that's something that they came up with for the pilot, and then later they decided on another story direction. They had to kind of massage it. But I love that idea. And really, there was always a possibility that Twin Peaks would not be picked up by ABC. I think they actually thought that was probably the likely outcome. So that's a whole other parallel universe in which we don't get any more Twin Peaks. This pilot just exists in isolation, and we live forever with it as a open-ended mystery. We'll never know who killed Laura, and that speaks to something different that I think also appeals to Lynch. And I won't get into this too much because I already discussed it with with Twin Peaks Unwrapped, which I'd encourage you to go check out. But I do love that idea of this possibility of Twin Peaks existing as a story about never being able to know and kind of that longing to know. And I kind of think that's what Lynch wanted it to be, even though it turned out well that he went in another direction, in some ways at least. Next week, I'm going to be discussing the first season. I'm going to focus particularly on 3 episodes, 3 non-Lynch episodes, and then I'll do the same thing with season 2 the week after that. It's worth mentioning that there's this persistent falsehood that Lynch himself perpetuates, but it's easily disprovable. You know, the most cursory glance at a shooting schedule or even just the release dates shows that this is impossible. Lynch always likes to say that he shot Wild at Heart during season 2, and that's part of why season 2 fell through and, you know, didn't work out as he would wish, and he wasn't around, and that's not true. He finished Wild at Heart during season 1. His season 1 episode was shot out of order after he finished Wild at Heart. So that episode, you know, episode 2 or 3, depending how you count it, that was shot after Wild at Heart was already done. So Wild at Heart was completed way before season 2. And I think it's interesting to consider that some of his trepidation about what Twin Peaks became, even though in his interviews he says that, you know, season 2 was bad. I wonder if, to a certain extent, his memory's playing tricks on him, and he actually had some objections to season 1 as well, because I think season 1 is brilliant, but it takes the show in some different directions than the pilot might suggest. And I think those directions mostly work out, and maybe were even necessary to sustain it as a week-to-week show. But it is something different, you know, first of all, because you are moving to LA to a soundstage. But we'll discuss that more next week. I just want to note at this point, you have a collaboration between Lynch and Frost that feels really kind of nose to nose, like they seem like they're on the same page, complementing each other. And then I think after that, season 1 is more Frostian in a lot of ways. So I look forward to discussing that. In discussing the pilot, I mentioned the possibility of what if there was this cult, this secret society that was kind of, you know, probably a sex ring given Laura's activities, that was doing these strange things in the town, ritual murders, killing a young woman because she knew too much. And that's really the perfect segue into a film which actually does run with those ideas. Stanley Kubrick's last film, Eyes Wide Shut, commissioned by Steven. And I'm bringing on Andrew Cook to discuss that with me. So I hope you enjoy this segment. It's going to be a bit longer than the Film and Focus sections usually are, but it'll be worthwhile.
You've never been jealous about me, have you?
No, I haven't.
And why haven't you ever been jealous about me?
Well, I don't know, Alice. Maybe because you're my wife, and I know you would never be unfaithful to me.
You are very, very sure of yourself, aren't you?
No. I'm sure of you. Do you think that's funny? I need a cloak with a hood and a mask.
Okay, I think we'll find something for you.
I suppose you'd like the password.
If you'd like, sir.
Fidelia.
Thank you, sir.
I don't think you realize the danger you're in now.
You've been way out of your depth.
You've got to get away before it's too late.
I'm here with Andrew Cook. This is my second guest for the podcast, and we're going to be discussing Eyes Wide Shut, Stanley Kubrick's last film. Can you describe at all kind of your involvement with Kubrick's work?
It definitely started with 2001. As a kid, I was interested I just loved watching the AFI, countdowns, and 2001 was one that caught my interest on there. So I checked the VHS out from the library, and then The Shining followed from there. So, I mean, even, as a kid, when I had no real basis to really understand his work, I was transfixed by it.
It seems like all of his films had that arc where they came out and people didn't quite know what to make. Like, I remember this film was not really all that well received in 99. Some critics really liked it, but a lot of them felt like, well, it doesn't quite. I remember the biggest complaint I feel like I saw was that it wasn't erotic enough, which I don't know that that's really what he was going for. I put it this way: I think the Tom Cruise Nicole Kidman scenes are definitely about like their sexual relationship, but it seems like a lot of the other stuff, the orgy, is really more about like power and paranoia and kind of using sex as a means to that end.
Yeah, I would agree. I think in the beginning it conforms to some of the standard of the genre, of the erotic thriller, but it will eventually subvert it. And by the time it becomes a film about Tom Cruise's character's powerlessness, I would say.
How would you summarize the film?
Well, to me, Eyes Wide Shut is a journey into a man's self-identity. Tom Cruise's character comes to find himself. He comes to find that whatever power he felt that he had in society or in his relationship is illusory. And the film is essentially his journey into probing this powerlessness and then eventually accepting it, I believe, and hopefully moving towards something healthier.
Now, you mentioned that you felt like it subverted some of the tropes of the erotic thriller genre. What do you see those tropes as being, and how do you see it subverting them?
The beginning parts of the film really are kind of erotic. I believe you can see it in the way that Kubrick frames Alice, Nicole Kidman's character. She almost is reminiscent of classical paintings. Her scenes with the Hungarian man at the party are very kind of erotically charged, even more so, far more so than Tom Cruise's with the two women. But as it goes, it becomes more about, like you said, power and ritual. The kind of solemn self-seriousness of our, I would argue, maybe toxic marital paradigms, or at least perhaps Kubrick argues this. And at that point, it stops being, sexy and starts being something as unsettling as it is maybe absurd.
Hmm. And what do you see? Where do you see those turning points where the film starts with Tom Cruise's sort of sense of self-assurance and maybe some of the objectification of the Nicole Kidman character and everything? Where do you see those turning points in the film where it starts to become more about his powerlessness?
During the scene where they have an argument, after Nicole Kidman's character has been, she's gotten high, she's working through the fact that she just had an attraction to this man and that she saw her husband flirting with other women, and she tells him a story about a time she'd considered infidelity. And this shakes Tom Cruise's character. It unmoors his worldview, everything he thought he knew about his wife and about sexual relations, essentially.
I noticed that the big orgy party scene where he goes to this masked, not a ball exactly, but a masked event at this Long Island estate. It happens exactly halfway through the film, which I thought was interesting. So it's sort of structured with that at its center and then the fallout on either sides. Do you see particular moments within that just narratively during the party scene? And but also maybe stylistically or just in the way it's shot.
His powerlessness compounds as he now finds himself running against essentially a class of people to which he does not belong. We see him moving among the upper class, but he doesn't quite belong there. And he will, at this point, even start spending massive amounts of money to try to work through the mystery. You will notice that he's often kind of isolated in these scenes. He is cut off. And then, of course, it climaxes with him being surrounded. So I think that it's, you can see it both in the mise en scène and just kind of in the narrative.
Yeah, he stands very much aside from this big group of masked men that's in the center of the room and the women. Like he's kind of off in a corner. And I think Kubrick plays a lot with Tom Cruise's height in this film, which I'm sure is no accident because Kubrick is known to be not the kindest director of actors, and they'll often, I think, exploit their kind of weaknesses or insecurities. And I think he does that a lot with Tom Cruise because Tom Cruise is known to be a little bit uncomfortable with, with his height, and obviously, not to get too biographical or anything, but it's like there were obviously rumors of him being gay, and he has the Yale students in the film like yelling at him in the street for like no apparent reason whatsoever. Which is interesting too because that's their, they've got the Yale shirts on, they're kind of Ivy Leaguers, and it adds to this class element as well in a weird way because they're very casually dressed and he's a little more nicely dressed, but even so, they've got this kind of free reign in a way that he doesn't, which I think is interesting. But they have the woman at the party kind of towering over him. He just seems very diminutive. Now, what did this? You said this was your girlfriend's first viewing of Eyes Wide Shut. Like, what did she make of it as like a first impression?
She really loved Kubrick's approach to the film. She tends to like Christmas movies, so she really admired the look of the film.
Oh yeah, this is a Christmas movie. I just want to say the next time somebody tries to come in with their like, counterintuitive, aha, Die Hard is the best Christmas movie. This should be the new Die Hard is the best Christmas movie.
She was often embarrassed by Tom Cruise's completely ineffectual kind of macho displays, right? Flashing his medical license like it's a police badge.
That made me laugh so hard throughout this movie.
Yeah, she really admired the film, and she usually does not like Tom Cruise movies. So that was, a testament, I suppose.
Tom Cruise, to me, he's like a Michael Douglas actor in that I find him really effective when he's being either an asshole or under somebody's thumb and panicked and like uncomfortable and insecure. And when he's playing somebody who's like really satisfied with himself and you're supposed to like, he just comes off as like obnoxious to me, which is exactly how I feel about Michael Douglas. Like, love him as Gordon Gekko, want to like punch him as the American president, basically.
Cruise, I feel, yeah, he's professional enough to carry some blockbuster well enough, like Edge of Tomorrow, but he only really comes alive if he's slimy, like in this or Collateral or Magnolia.
Now, what did you think of Nicole Kidman? Because this is a part people love. Like, I feel like they don't give too much praise to Tom Cruise in this film, but she gets a lot of praise for this. And honestly, I find her performance, I think it does exactly what it's supposed to do and everything, but I find it extremely annoying at times. Like the way she stretches every single word out and she's like dancing around each line and Kubrick just has her like, it's kind of maddening, which I guess is the point.
I did like it, especially in the beginning. It definitely kind of conforms to what you might expect of an erotic thriller. And I did enjoy her physicality. Really, a lot of the cast had great small bits of physical performance.
It has a very interesting supporting cast. Like, there's a lot of familiar faces kind of scattered throughout. And they just kind of pop in and out of Tom Cruise's story. I think Sidney Pollack in particular is like really, really well cast. This scene where he's in the pool room with Cruise, I find really effective.
Yeah, that's probably my favorite scene in the film as far as acting goes. And I think he brings the best out of Cruise in that scene. From the beginning, you can tell that he's this very slimy, decadent man.
I was surprised to find I had totally forgotten that and I actually don't feel like they highlight it a ton in the film. There's one line where they underline it, and then it's evident from other clues. But the woman who saves Tom Cruise at the party is the woman that he saved from the overdose at the first party in the film. And I think at one point, and not this time, but a previous time watching it, I expected the prostitute who has HIV, that she was the one that saved him, the masked woman. But of course, it's the woman from the beginning. And I thought that was kind of a nice little bring around and sort of a indication that, Tom Cruise is probably one of the few men that this woman ever met. I keep calling them all by their actors' names. I don't know why. I can't even remember what his name is in this film. But, the Tom Cruise character, he was probably one of the only people who was just at all halfway decent towards her. So she kind of knows who he is, and it makes total sense then that she would go over towards him and try to save him because it saved her. So that's actually a nice little bit of almost like classical screenwriting on Kubrick's part, in a film that in some ways is more unconventional in this sort of episodic story it tells.
One thing that I was surprised by is just how modern the film feels. Like, it was made in 99, but it really speaks to 2018. As I kind of jokingly told my girlfriend, the film is essentially about a guy who gets cuffed and then stumbles onto Pizzagate. Something I really like about it is that decision to set it at Christmas time. It plays into, I think, sort of America's kind of Puritan tradition, which I think is something that frames so many of the relationships of the film. You either get this kind of false intimacy of Bill and Alice that she shakes up for him, pretty severely. And then you get this sort of commodified sense of intimacy represented by, the various prostitutes, Domino, Lily Sobieski's character, I can't remember her name, and of course the cult. And what I find interesting is, for all of the cult's kind of paganistic, hedonistic ennui, there's still kind of a pretty vanilla cult. Like, they still sort of seem driven by that kind of Puritanesque idea. Oh, we have to hide ourselves behind masks. We would threaten or straight up kill people to protect this secret. We associate sexuality with these solemn, self-serious rituals. That was something I found really interesting watching the film now for the first time in so many years.
I'm actually really glad you brought up the Puritan point because it reminds me of something I almost forgot. And it struck me while I was watching it this time that the film, I think, really plays with the young Goodman Brown kind of template. It's the story of this young Puritan who goes out into the woods in New England one night, and he's meeting the devil there, and he's very nervous, like, I can't believe I'm transgressing the community and the society by doing this, and yet, but once he's out there, the devil shows him, oh no, everybody in the community's in on this. And then he sees, like, even his wife at the end is, like, participating in this satanic ritual. And then, like, he wakes up the next day and he's not sure if it was a dream, but he's haunted by this for the rest of his life. And they specifically mention that he's kind of hesitant to, like, he shrinks from, like, his wife's touch, and they're kind of alienated from each other after that because he can't trust her anymore. And I think Eyes Wide Shut takes that kind of allegory and it almost splits the two parts, like the explicit part where it's about the husband distrusting the wife because he discovers that she has her own sexual life outside of him, even just an internal sexual life, but then also the social aspect is kind of split off. They never really explore this direction, but there are various points where it's very subtly suggested, what if Nicole Kidman was there at the party as well? And what if she's actually a part of this cult? And I think that ties in the two strands of the narrative together, because we have this very personal strand, which is his shock at discovering that she even considered infidelity, that she has these fantasies and that she has this life and this kind of desire that is outside of him. And then there's this other more social aspect of discovering this hidden externalized world of sexuality tied in with the elite and their hidden secret sex parties and things like that. Those two strands are separate, but there are various points where they're pulled together a little bit. One is her dream, where she talks about having sex with all these different men, and it's almost like she dreamed where he was, like it's almost kind of a Lynchian thing, like they're connected that way. And then another point is when she is on the bed and he sees the mask, and it's like, how did the mask get there? I think it's interesting that the film keeps those two strands separate, even though there's obviously some sort of almost subconscious connection between them. I'd love to hear people's thoughts on that.
What's interesting is, to go back to some of the older conspiracies, it really reminded me of certain things like the Franklin thing or the Dutroux thing, where ultimately the evidence we get is presented as just, so many loose ends that could be as mundane as it is sinister.
What is the Franklin thing?
The Franklin thing was a conspiracy of basically the higher-ups in the Republican Party running a child sex trafficking ring out through Boys Town in Omaha, Nebraska. Dutroux is a somewhat similar thing, except I think it was in the Netherlands. And in all these cases, they never find any other evidence that amounts to anything more than like a loose end, of course. And the people who are investigating it have their authority, challenged, trumped, I guess you could say. Bill's ineffectual investigation into the cult leads nowhere. What he does find out, could be as mundane as it is sinister, going by his conversation with Ziegler at the end. And it did remind me of some of those older conspiracies from the 80s and 90s as well. It's very much to the film's credit that it's just about this kind of relatively vanilla sex ring. I mean, I think it's a more interesting choice and roots it more into, like I say, that kind of some of the weird assumptions we have about marriage and how human sexuality should be expressed after being married. So it's honestly, to me, one of the most interesting things. And I was curious what you felt about this idea that I had. Upon watching the film, it almost felt like a sort of spiritual successor in some ways to Barry Lyndon, with basically a man having to come to terms with his relative power in a larger culture, with essentially the candlelight of Barry Lyndon replaced with Christmas lights here in Eyes Wide Shut.
I love that, yeah. Barry Lyndon is my favorite Kubrick film, I think. And these two Kubrick films have my favorite lighting of any Kubrick film. Like, I just think they're both gorgeous to look at. And I think that's totally right. Like, these are two characters who have raised their sort of station in the world. You get the sense maybe from where they initially came from. And they're not quite of the upper echelon, and yet they're able to kind of move about and maybe at times assume that they have more of a kind of presence in it than they do. And then they're very much put in their place. And that happens to both of the characters, I think. And of course, one spans many years or even decades, and the other one is, it's like two or 3 days. But yeah, that's a great comparison. I love that. This is definitely, I think, maybe the Kubrick film that feels most linked to Lynch. And they kind of have an interesting relationship in that Kubrick proclaimed to George Lucas, actually, that Eraserhead was his favorite film of all time. This is a film, it has some of those uncanny moments that feel kind of Lynchian. What's interesting to me, though, is if I was to connect this to one of Lynch's films, it would be Mulholland Drive, and that actually came out after Eyes Wide Shut and was shot, I want to say around the same time, but the thing with Eyes Wide Shut was this was a really long production. Like, I actually remember I was like I guess 12, 13 or whatever. And, I was obsessed with movies already at that point. And I used to read, my mother used to get People magazine. I used to read it all the time. And they would have all these articles about Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman shooting Eyes Wide Shut back in like 1996. And then it would be like a year later and they'd be like, still checking in with Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman are still over in London after a year of shooting, still shooting this strange Stanley Kubrick sex film or whatever. Like, it was just this thing that was going for years. It overlaps a little with Mulholland Drive, but obviously, if anything influenced anything, this would have influenced Mulholland Drive because of the chronology.
And I like how there are so many interesting bits of performance that are quintessentially Lynchian in Eyes Wide Shut. The guy looking through the glass at his daughter like he's an insect, or Tom Cruise craning his neck to like an inch away from the dead girl. The physicality of Nicole Kidman. Yeah, I was reminded of Lynch.
I don't think Kubrick is as interested or intent on carving out a fully fleshed kind of dream space. It's more of an uncanny that's just tiptoeing to the edge of that. And it doesn't quite go over, Like, for example, I think the most uncanny, haunting part of the film is when he first enters the mansion and that music is playing. That's like a really effective music choice. It's very kind of, it's what you would expect. Maybe it's kind of conventional in that sense, but it's still really effective with almost the sort of Gregorian chants or whatever going on, that deep, ominous humming, and the guy in the red robe and the circle of women kneeling with the masks and the cloaks on. And there's a moment in that which is very definitely touches in the same vein as a lot of Lynch, which is the characters turning and staring at him with the masks.
Yeah, directly into the camera.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, it's so unnerving. It's creepy despite the absurdity of it all. It's so creepy that when I watch it, it's still scary even after having seen the scene parodied in It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia.
What is the password? Orgy. You may enter.
What the hell is this place? What did you bring me to?
This is a buffet.
Well, I can see that it's a buffet, but why is there a buffet at a goddamn orgy, Frank?
Well, you don't want to bang on an empty stomach, do you?
I don't want to bang any of these people anyway. They're all paunchy and weird and old.
You can't tell under the mask.
I can absolutely tell. And why are our costumes so much more elaborate than everybody else's? Like they didn't put any effort into it. Oh, Jesus Christ. That guy's not even wearing a mask.
Well, he's got the right idea. This beak is interfering with my
What
knot.
do you do? Don't take it off. Oh, Jesus.
And then one character we haven't mentioned, I guess maybe would be worth mentioning for a moment, is Nick Nightingale. He's kind of Tom Cruise's key to this world. And what's interesting is he's almost a character whose relationship to the Cruise character is like Cruise's relationship to the Pollock character, where they kind of move in the same circle, but one is kind of doing better and more secure than the other. And kind of uses them in a moment or needs their help in a moment to get some sort of goal. In Pollock's case, he has to help this woman who's overdosed in his house. And then in the other case, Cruise needs the Nightingale character to get him the password. Which, interesting, Linoff, I didn't think about this until you said it. I feel like I've heard people mention it before, but it just kind of slipped my mind until you brought it up, is the password is Fidelio. And of course, the whole film is about infidelity. But Nightingale is interesting in that sense, and also because even the woman, the former Miss New York, who sacrifices herself to Cruise and kind of ends up on the margin of the story while we're focused on the marriage and there's the safety of the stars. Even she gets at least that moment where he like leans over her on the slab and you kind of realize this horror of what's happened to her because of him. But Nightingale, we never see him again, and he brushes it off with, he went back to Seattle, but you have to wonder, like, what did happen? Did they kill him? And if they killed him, they probably killed his whole family because they can't, they would wonder what happened to him. I almost kind of think they let him live, which maybe says something about the misogyny of the group as well.
Something interesting about Nick Nightingale, and really just the whole thing, is even if, let's take Ziegler at his word, and all that was staged, because, I mean, there even was a performative aspect to Mandy's speech at the club, like, I will redeem him. Let's take Ziegler at his word.
Sure.
Yeah, there's still, I mean, obviously the element of misogyny is still obvious, right? Because, I mean, it's clearly, he was, even upset that he had to keep her around for an hour,
Yeah, that's true. He wanted her out of there.
And yeah, as far as Nick goes, yeah, I mean, even if they just beat him and sent him on his way, that still speaks to a level of power, a level of things they think they can get away with. Or having Bill followed, which is to me one of the kind of low-key, just a great chase sequence.
Yeah, I love that.
And the score mirrors it, right? Like they play the same notes with different keys to emulate two different footsteps going down the street. And it culminates with Cruise buying a newspaper where the headline says, "Lucky to be alive."
Yeah, that wasn't too subtle.
Even if we take Ziegler at his word, they're still quite awful, To an extent, I mean, obviously it has that same kind of uniformity of style that sums up, late Kubrick from 2001 on. And some of the blocking choices definitely reminded me a bit of A Clockwork Orange. But the best comparison, I think would be Barry Lyndon.
Is there anything else you wanted to share before signing off?
All right. Well, like you said, my name is Andrew Cook. I am a writer of little renown, but you can follow me on Twitter at MasterMastermind with no I.
Did you come up with that name or anything in relation to the Mastermind posts on The Shining?
Actually, that's coincidence. The name comes from when I put my actual name into the Wu-Tang Clan name generator.
As I mentioned throughout this episode, I would love to hear from people on this film. I think this is one of the films that I'm covering that has kind of the most to talk about. So please do send your feedback in. And I'd also point people to another friend who's going to be a guest at some point on the show and was maybe going to come on for this one as well. Bob Clark, he has a webcomic series which does sort of a riff and a parody of Eyes Wide Shut for a whole sort of story cycle. As I mentioned, the other topic section this week is going to be focused on a single topic, although it's a very multifaceted topic, and that's Mary Shelley and the creation of Frankenstein. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I tweeted a little bit about it recently, not so much in terms of the specific story, but this idea of like a fresh cultural mythology, something that comes out, something that came out in modern times. It wasn't built up over centuries by anonymous sources, but came out of one person's mind and took on a life of its own. That's a concept that's fascinated me for a while. I actually want to read a little piece from something I wrote years ago. It's actually part of this week's Opening the Archive section, that same period in 2012. And this incident I described was kind of the impetus for this piece. About a month ago, as several friends got drunk and prepared food for a party later that evening, the TV droned somewhere in the distance. At some point in the afternoon, Alvin and the Chipmunks Meet Frankenstein appeared on screen, and no one bothered to shut it off. For an hour or two, the hypnotically grating, high-pitched rodents serenaded us with their screams and weirdly precise vocal delivery. I caught very little of the movie as I wandered in and out of the room, but what I saw and heard fascinated me. How bizarre that from a dark and stormy night early in 19th century Geneva, as a group of romantic poets and intellectuals told ghost stories to keep themselves amused, we wind up with a colorful cartoon of squeaky-voiced, commercially driven anthropomorphized animals chased around by a creature so familiar to us that it's naturally assumed even the toddlers watching will already know his name. Interesting, the movie itself, from what I saw, is not just about Frankenstein, or rather, Dr. Frankenstein's creation, but who has the energy to contest it anymore. It's also about the Frankenstein legacy. The characters meet the monster in a theme park, that perfect 80s, 90s symbol of pop cultural experience boiled down to its essence. Devoted to monster movies, relics of a past which can be played with and repurposed. So recently, I tweeted about this, and I asked the question, what is the earliest modern example of a creator casually coming up with an interesting idea which spawned a pop culture mythology iconography that remains ubiquitous to the present day? I'm thinking maybe Mary Shelley on Lake Geneva in 1816. And people responded, they mentioned Gulliver's Travels, Don Quixote, and I said, good point, although I think the difference is future adaptations and tributes stuck fairly closely to the original text, didn't they? Whereas Frankenstein mushroomed into many other stories and variations, with characters breaking off and being used separate from the narrative. It fits in nicely with a lot of 20th century icons that way, Superman, Star Wars, or Sherlock Holmes from the 19th century. Somebody else mentioned Romeo and Juliet, and I said, yeah, I was wondering about Shakespeare. So much of it is adapting existing works, but Romeo and Juliet is, relatively as these things go, of course, an original, right? That said, I guess there are a couple different overlapping categories, stories that have become ubiquitous, and characters and icons. Frankenstein, interestingly, seems to belong to both, as a story and a character. And the latter category, the characters, tend to lend themselves to more diffuse uses. And then I mentioned the Alvin and the Chipmunks thing. I said, there's no Alvin and Chipmunks meet Romeo and Juliet that I know of. It's usually an adaptation of Romeo and Juliet as an adaptation of the story. So I'm just fascinated by this idea that, on this stormy night out on a retreat of these very specific people, the specific place and time, this idea was struck upon, this idea of this creature that was created and, out of human parts and became this kind of monster. And then somehow that morphed into all these different incarnations. The famous 1930s film, A Century Later. I mean, there was already a century of stuff before then. It reminded me that I read a book about this around the time that I wrote that essay. And the book was called Frankenstein, A Cultural History, though there's a lot of other books like it. There was an essay, which I'll link up below, that discusses some of these books, and it mentions, I thought a couple of the descriptions were interesting. They say, Frankenstein can be described as a story that everyone knows, without ever having read or seen any version of it. Few stories have such a discrepancy between their original narrative and their pop culture representation. Frankenstein is as much misunderstood by pop culture as the monster is misunderstood by its creator. Of course, pointing out, how people call the monster itself Frankenstein and how it's come to exist in this mostly purely horror context, whereas there's a lot more going on than that in the book. I'm throwing this out there not just as sort of something that, just to mention what I was talking about, but also to hear your thoughts on this. I'd love for this to be an ongoing conversation. Like, do you see other works that have that kind of similar impact, where it's not just a story, but a character or other elements that can be detached from that origin and spun off, to Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, Alvin and the Chipmunks meet Frankenstein, Frankenstein in this context, Frankenstein in that context, a Halloween costume, where somebody created something specific that's become sort of a cultural meme in a way, on that level. I'd love to hear what other people think, and also if you have thoughts on Frankenstein itself as well. And of course, it's a relevant topic now because this is the 200th anniversary this year of the publication of Frankenstein, and there's a movie coming out about Mary Shelley, which I've sort of been hearing mixed things about on Twitter, just people's reactions to the trailer and things like that. I'll link up a particular thread where they're talking about not just that, but also a show that's on right now called The Frankenstein Chronicles. And it seems like the people talking about it have issues with both. They feel like it de-emphasizes Mary Shelley too much. And, in the Frankenstein Chronicles, the Frankenstein monster is like a real creature, and she's just kind of reporting it. She's not creating it. It's interesting to what extent I think sometimes these works get away from their author. And certainly a hell of a lot more people are familiar with Frankenstein monster than know Mary Shelley's name. But at the same time, I think she's gotten to remain remarkably attached to it. There was even that film in the 90s, I think with De Niro as the creature, and Kenneth Branagh, I think he may have directed it as well. And he played Dr. Frankenstein. It was called Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It was a follow-up to Bram Stoker's Dracula, where they really put the author's name in the title to make you feel like, okay, this is more to do with the book than sort of what it's become. And of course, way back in the 30s, Elsa Lanchester, who plays the Bride of Frankenstein, also plays Mary Shelley in an opening sequence where she's sitting by the fire as the storm clouds roll over Lake Geneva, and they're all trading ideas for, a story. She's kind of gotten to retain some foothold in that kind of runaway creation, which, is a interesting term to use for a story about a runaway creation as well. Finally, in closing, before I move on to the listener feedback, I want to read a quote from the book, one of my favorite quotes from it, which is about the birth of the monster, so to speak. And I just love the way it contrasts with the famous scene from the film, where there's this grand thunder and lightning and this table that rises up to the top of this castle. And, it's a really fun, cool, gothic horror scene. But there's something chilling about the cold, almost detached way that she writes about it, where you actually feel the horror of this idea that you've been laboring away on dead matter, and then suddenly it has a life of its own. It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 a.m, the rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out, when, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limb. I have a few pieces of listener feedback I want to share this week, and I'm going to save some more for next week because I have quite a lot of comments on one of the podcasts that I think deserve a space of their own. I want to start with Jake's comments on my site about a couple podcasts back, the Pie episode. And on that one, I discussed not just the Aronofsky film, but also this idea that Harley Peyton, one of the writers of seasons 1 and 2 of Twin Peaks, had about the finale, the 2-part finale of season 3 being kind of 2 solo albums, one by Frost and one by Lynch. And I love that idea. It's kind of a poetic idea. But Jake had some sort of disagreements with it, some interesting points that he brought up. Jake said, I regard Peyton as an unreliable witness and wonder if he ever got over his bust-up with Lynch during season 2, whatever that was really all about. In the first part of his Graffiti with Punctuation interview, he says, Mark was hiring the directors on season 1, which conveniently ignores the fact that all of them, except maybe Leslie Linka Glatter, had prior ties to Lynch, one way or another. Frost didn't bring in anyone from Hill Street Blues. Re-1718's solo albums, Lynch has basically said that Freddie was his idea, and given Jake Wardle has confirmed they spent years Skyping, there's no reason to doubt it. I commented a little bit on that, and, I'll let you go to the site and read that if you want. Jake continued, Freddie and his glove no doubt have multiple levels, like everything, but I took it on first viewing as kind of a dumb comedy Lynch has often talked about, but only occasionally incorporated into his features. Keeping us hanging for 25 years, then wrapping things up with a showdown out of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers is a hell of a long way to go for a gag. The first time through 17 and 18, I did have the feeling, if not quite consciously, that things were happening twice. When Cooper and Diane cross over, it's as if they're passing through a mirror, and what follows is a kind of reflection of what has come before. I also received a comment from Saba on the episode, but this was in reference more to the film in focus, Pi. They wrote, I'm only halfway through the episode, but I already have some feedback regarding the Pi review. I have seen this film multiple times, although the last time may be 10 years ago, and I have fond memories of it. I agree with your viewpoint that the film suggests the protagonist is on to something big. To me, this film embodies the kind of mystery that draws me to fiction in general. I love fiction that tackles the bigger questions in life, that searches for something that transcends our day-to-day reality. When engaging with such fictional mysteries, although you know you're watching fiction, you still hope that these works will unveil some greater truth. And thus, while watching Pi, I found myself rooting for the protagonist, hoping he would succeed in reaching his goals, and thus disappointed when he drilled his genius away. Twin Peaks holds the same kind of mystery for me. Twin Peaks also tackles those big questions, the afterlife, the existence of the souls, multiple layers of reality. When watching Twin Peaks, part of me hopes and imagines that Frost and Lynch somehow drew their inspiration from a mutual creative experience where they got a glimpse of the bigger picture. Having watched mysterious fiction for most of my life, I have not discovered any greater truths, but still hoping for it when I engage with a new work. I'm at a time in my life where I consider digging deeper. Although I'm not a spiritual nor a religious person, I attended an info session about transcendental meditation. The time isn't ripe to commit to it now, but I might take the plunge in the future. Kind regards, Saba. I also received feedback from Jeff on the following episode, the one that's on Spirited Away. And he really responded to pretty much every section that I did. The film in focus was Spirited Away. I talked about two perspectives on Twin Peaks, a theory and a Reddit thread, the bomb trap theory about Laura being bait for Judy, and then also this LSD user wrote about, their experience after an acid trip watching the Return. And I discussed both of those, and I also discussed a 90s aesthetic and what that even is, if such a thing exists, and also talked about the death of movie going based on a Matt Zoller site thread. So he kind of responded to all these points in there. He wrote, great installment. Lots of thoughts occurred as I was listening, so let's see how well I remember them a few hours later. Cool that you're watching Star Trek. If you're watching on Netflix, I assume it's the remastered version with lots of new or modified special effects shots. As far as I know, it makes very little, if any, difference to the narrative, but it might be worth mentioning. I'd wondered if you'd seen that acid trip Twin Peaks report, and here he's referring to a theory that I discussed on that episode. More of a overall perspective than a theory, but something that was in a Reddit thread. He continues, I think it's really great and gets to the point better than almost anything else I've seen. I like the bomb trap theory, but as you say, it rings false on an intuitive level. When you were talking about the symmetry of the show and referred to the bomb, I guess you meant the nuclear test in episode 8, but I immediately thought of the end of season 2 with the bomb trap in the bank. That's the sort of narrative echo that makes the theory a bit more compelling. It's a shame to hear of the slow death of cinema going in the US. In the UK, attendance is pretty stable and much higher than it was in the 80s and 90s. New screens seem to be opening all the time. I think proportionally attendance is still higher in the US, so perhaps we're just heading towards the same mean average, but there's a phenomenon in this country of luxury cinema chains like Picture House and Everyman that are priced a little higher than the multiplexes, but rely on a subscription membership business model with reduced ticket prices, etc. for members. These places generally offer better food and amenities and provide a mix of blockbusters, art house film, and classics. It seems like a pretty successful model, and the film-going experience is generally a good one. Do you have anything like this in the States? And to answer that I would say with art houses, yes, but I don't think so much with mainstream films. I don't know of any places, at least near anywhere where I've lived, that are sort of a subscription basis but show, new releases in addition to, as he mentions, art house films and classics. He continues, your talk about decades and aesthetics reminds me of a book I was given in 1999 called The Look of the Century. It was a visual retrospective of the history design over the course of the 20th century, and it was interesting, but it really struggled to nail down the current decade of the 1990s. The sections on fashion by decade were particularly odd. The book kept repeating that, unlike previous decades, there was no single style for the 90s, and the example it offered for menswear was a bizarre tan-colored Nehru jacket and sandals ensemble that I saw literally nobody wearing ever. I think we would find it easier to define a 90s style now in hindsight. Stereotyping is easier from a distance. This week's Opening the Archive chapter is called Best Face Forward, and it details May 2012 to January 2013. This was a period where I did a fair amount of work. This was about a year. I didn't post anything for the first part of the year. I had moved to California, and then I had an issue with my computer, and then I started, kind of resumed the site after a 4 or 5 month break. And during that summer, I posted very slowly, usually bigger pieces. The honorable mentions that I wanted to make for this week are a couple pieces I wrote during the summer. One is called Spade and Marlowe Private Eyes, and it compares the detective heroes of Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett, and how those characters, both played by Humphrey Bogart in their most famous incarnations, are subtly different from one another. They have very different outlooks on life, and how that's reflected both in the books and in the films, and how the films differ from the books. And I love making those types of comparisons. And then also another piece making comparison was called 60s Reunion, comparing The Big Chill to The Return of the Secaucus 7, and providing a lot of context as well. This is another one that I would give honorable mention this week. If it weren't for the short film, I wanted to highlight 2 films about boomers getting together 15 years after the 60s ended. And it's just interesting how these 2 films have very similar stories, even down to the number of people involved, and they're all getting together for a weekend at one character's place. And yet there's so many differences. Return of the Secaucus 7 is a much more low-key film. It really invented the indie movement in a lot of ways. It was John Sayles' first film. And then Big Chill is far more slick. It's produced by a big studio. It's done by Lawrence Kasdan, who is in with Lucas and Spielberg, of course, and has written many of the new Star Wars films. And what's interesting is the characters are much more yuppie-ish at this point. But this was much broader because I went into the 60s, the whole history of the 60s, and how the term baby boomers even arose, and all these generational demographics and stuff like that. It was really fun to research and write. It's part of the August archive that's linked. In the fall, I tried to come up with a more systematic way of posting again. So throughout October, I did 3 posts a week, and each week there was a different, very loose theme. One week it was films that had themes about Africa. One week it was films about teenagers in high school, and there was a fantasy one, and it was really more just films I happened to review, and then I kind of noticed the connections later and tried to group them together that way. But after that, I started a routine that I would not finish, in some cases, for 4 years. I was doing a favorite series based on a 100 favorite films list I made the year before, and I finally finished it in 2015 and 2016. Likewise, I started a series on Neon Genesis Evangelion, an episode guide, and I covered that first episode arc, the first 7 episodes of the series, but that I wouldn't resume until 2015, and then I would finish it then. Also in this fall, I created my first narrated video essays. I did one on Fists in the Pocket, which is one of my favorite films, and that was really my first attempt at that. I'm kind of happy with how it came out, I would say, overall. I also did a video essay on the Chaplin film Modern Times, which was a ton of fun to put together. I did it all in one big rush, where 3 people, including me, narrated various critics, Graham Greene, Otis Ferguson, and Roland Barthes. And I juxtaposed their different analyses against each other and illustrated them with clips from the film. And you can find that from December, the December section of the archive that's linked below. But the main thrust of what I was doing was to build toward my short film, Class of 2002, which was a fictional documentary. That film was told mostly through snapshots, like actual snapshots from actors that I reached out to who were interested in providing personal photos. And through that, I told a story of these 5 characters who are classmates of the narrator of the film. And he talks about his experiences with them growing up in the first half of the film. And then the second half talks about their really all tragic experiences after graduation, where they all ended up. Fair warning is, sort of a depressing movie. It doesn't have too much of a light touch, but I think it's a compelling thing that I really haven't seen too many other films like this. So that was nice to kind of create something that felt original in that sense. And oddly enough, I didn't intend it to be like one of those films that like tricks you, like at the end you go, oh, it was all made up, that can work if it's sort of a tongue-in-cheek thing, but I think with a more serious topic, you want to be careful about that. But in this case, because I didn't put a disclaimer or anything, people did actually watch it and think it was real until the ending, and some people were a little bit upset by that, understandably, that they'd sort of invested in it as one thing and found out it was something else. But I was sort of flattered in a way that people actually thought that it was real. And the interesting thing is, I wrote about all of this in what is my highlight of this week. It's not the film itself per se, but an essay I wrote about the making of it. And then at the end, of course, there's the video too, if somebody wants to check it out. But in this, I described the whole process of coming up with the idea and then struggling with making the characters and then the practical challenges faced. I thought this would be a fairly easy production to do because, hey, it's all photos, it's all pre-existing stuff, it's just editing. But of course, I had to record voiceover, I had to get actors involved, I had to shoot a few things, and at the time I was like working every day at a couple of retail jobs, so I was juggling a lot of stuff, and I was just really happy that it came together, and it's still something I like to highlight. It's sort of off the beaten path a little bit from other stuff I've done. It's a 20-minute short film. Finally, to wrap up this episode, and for YouTubers, I'm going to have to do a little explanation here. I'm actually mentioning every piece that I've written over the past 10 years at the end of every episode. For each chapter of my archive that I do, I name all the pieces. And that's often a lot of pieces. So I just kind of embrace the ridiculousness of it, and I just read them really fast. If, one title pops out to you, you can go check it out on my site. There's various directories and search functions you can use. But really, it's just more of a fun sort of self-indulgent way to end each episode. So with that, I'll introduce the music that I used to score this, and hope you hear something fleetingly that catches your interest. From May, Lost and Found and Back in Action. What are 100 of your favorite movies? Ben-Hur, 1959 version, The Long Goodbye. From June, This Is Not a Film and Venom and Eternity, a dual review. Fragments of Cinephilia Part 2, IMDb comments with The Wild One as the top image. Spade and Marlowe, Private Eyes, The Maltese Falcon, The Big Sleep, on page and screen, a dual review. From July, The Muddled Message of The Dark Knight Rises, Art on the March, a visual mixtape, a list of favorite paintings. From August, Silence is Golden, the 2 versions of The Gold Rush, 60s Reunion, The Big Chill and The Return to Secaucus 7, a dual review. From September, Connecting the Movies, discussion of the state of cinema. Time Travel and Pretty Pictures in a Fall Forecast, status update. Fragments of Cinephilia, Part 3, IMDb comments with Sweet Movie as the top image. Who's Killing Cinema and Who Cares? Thoughts on a David Denby essay. Great Minds Think Alike, Dance of the Criterion Collection, noticing similarities between new video montage and one I'd made a year ago. Movies I watched in 2012. October and Beyond, kicking off a month-long schedule. From October, Rosetta, Fast Times at Ridgemont High, The Dangerous Lives of Altar Boys, Sullivan's Travels, They Were Expendable, A Canterbury Tale and Hail the Conquering Hero, a triple review. Hallowell's 100 and Hills of Poppin', The Amazing Grace and Amazing Grace, a dual review. Blood Diamond and Lord of War, a dual review. La Havre and La Vie de Bohème, a dual review. The Secret of Nim and The Last Unicorn, another dual review, seeing a pattern here. The Dark Crystal, Precocious Pastiche, Recycled Culture and 80s Kids Cartoons, and Beyond. Grey's Anatomy and Everything is Going Fine, a dual review of the Spalding Gray films. Lucasfilm Lost, thoughts on Disney's purchase of Lucasfilm. From November, Unleash the Beast, visual tribute to Transformation, the 1932 Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Neon Genesis Evangelion, Episode 1, Angel Attack. I'm making a movie and I need your help. These are a few of my favorite films. Neon Genesis Evangelion, Episode 2, The Beast. A Dangerous Method, The Favorites, Le Viaje Memoria. Number 100. Sorry for slaughtering that Spanish. Neon Genesis Evangelion, Episode 3, A Transfer. Lincoln, The Favorites, La Haine. Number 99. Lovely Paola, Something to be Thankful for. Visual tribute to Paola Pitagora and Fists in the Pocket. Neon Genesis Evangelion Episode 4, Hedgehog's Dilemma. Give me your links. Invitation to Best of the Blogosphere, which never happened. The Favorites, Lost in Translation, number 98. Neon Genesis Evangelion Episode 5, Ray 1. From December, I Am My Brother's Reaper, a video essay on Fists in the Pocket. The Favorites, Celine and Julie Go Boating, number 97. Island of Lost Pictures, Neon Genesis Evangelion Episode 6, Ray 2. The Favorites, Dogville, number 96. Want to read an essay about Chaplin? Comedy Countdown, Modern Times, a video essay. Burnt Offerings, visual tribute to Hollis Frampton's nostalgia. Neon Genesis Evangelion Episode 7, A Human Work. The Favorites, Persona, number 95, a preview of my upcoming short film Class of 2002. Leap of Faith, visual tribute to Crossing the Chasm in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. From January, Class of 2002, directed by Joel Bacco. Class of 2002 Part 2, Class of 2002 Part 3, I've Made a Movie, 2002 and 2012, The Making of My Movie, Class of 2002. Obama, Recollections of a Premonition. Pictures of Memory, Images and Words from Class of 2002, a visual tribute with quotes from Class of 2002. And finally, the post just called Class of 2002, which summed up all of the different posts of this month. Thank you for listening, if you're still with me. And I hope that if you enjoyed some of this, or all of this, or any of this, or a moment here or there, or even if you just enjoy my public work and you want to support that you'll consider becoming a patron. It's patreon.com/lostinthemovies. Links are below. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for being a supporter of this. And hopefully I can provide many more experiences you enjoy in the future as well. Next week, I'm going to be discussing the film The Piano, the Jane Campion film. I'm also going to discuss the first season of Twin Peaks with particular emphasis on several episodes that I haven't watched in a little while. I'm going to discuss a lot of things that I've been talking about on Twitter, particularly a lot of political topics. So if that's your thing, you'll get your taste of that then. And I'm also going to talk about a period in 2013 from my archives where I was doing a lot of screen cap exercises where I would just keep a viewing diary of everything I was watching. A lot of Holy Grail films, so we'll get to that as well. And I'm going to highlight one of my early video essays that I like a lot from then. I'll see you then, and until then, let's get lost in the movies together.
Let's defrost in a romantic mist. Let's get crossed off everybody's list. To celebrate this night we found each other. Let's get lost. Oh, let's get lost.